service. I know everybody thought they were coming to a financial summit tonight, but game time decision, we turned it into a financial roundtable for the purposes of actually hoping to have exactly that, a fluid discussion. I'm going to present the framework for a plan tonight. The framework is based on a number of assumptions that we'll go through. I want to make it very clear that this is not the plan indefinite. The plan is going to draw certain conclusions, but rather we're here in August to begin an ongoing dialogue. So since I've arrived here a year ago, I start almost every financial presentation with this flow chart, the Town of Andover budget model. Every time I start off with it, I disclose that I can't take credit for it, but rather Chairman Stumpf can. But I think it's an effective way at looking at Andover's finances. And from this model, what we've done is really laid the backwork. This is the visual representation, but the technical representation is reflective of this. And tonight's presentation has really been molded based on this model. So Andover's 5-year financial forecast, it's based on a series of assumptions and schedules. The assumptions being those around certain revenues and expenditures, and schedules being those that fund our long-term liabilities. This is a dynamic document. It's a document that's a living document. It's going to change. We're going to draft 10, 12, 15 different scenarios to see how different levers or toggles that are available to us have an impact on our long-range financial plan and financial future. A financial forecast is a tool to establish predictability and identify structural impacts. So when we look at our long-range financial plan, there are going to be decisions that result in structural deficits or potential of excess revenue. We needed to discuss what's in the best interest of the community and how we mitigate negative impacts when they do in fact arise. And then lastly, this is to serve as a framework to sustain competitive and responsive community services. One thing that's certainly been clear to me since I've arrived is that this is a community that values the level of services they receive, and I believe it's incumbent upon us to sustain them. So I'm going to begin tonight with revenue assumptions. There are really 3 buckets of revenue that offset the appropriations of the town budget, the largest being property taxes. So the model that's going to be before you this evening assumes a number of things. That the town takes advantage of the 2.5% annual levy increase available under the limitations of Proposition 2.5. That we use a 5-year average of new growth, which is approximately $2 million. That's driven mainly by, we haven't, and I want to fully disclose this, the Department of Revenue hasn't certified FY17's new growth, but we expect it to be in the vicinity of 2.6 million. So for the purposes of tonight, we're using 2.6 million. It also assumes that the town maintains $300,000 in excess levy capacity, and that's per an existing vote of the Board of Selectmen. So the Board of Selectmen took a vote last September to do 2 things. 1, use the annual property tax bill increase as a metric for growth, and 2, to maintain prior year excess levy. So the prior year excess levy, based on prior votes of the Board of Selectmen, some decisions were made last year that moved some of the excess into the capital budget, but to maintain what the existing votes have provided for it, which is $300,000. On the state aid front, there's several state aid accounts. There's 2 major ones that make up the vast majority. In that Chapter 70, which is obviously school funding, and unrestricted general government aid, which is general state assistance. We're proposing that we increase that each year by 1%. And then lastly, local receipts. There's 24 categories of local receipts on the Department of Revenue's tax recapitulation sheet. We're again advocating to use a 5-year average, or approximately 11 million. If I could really quick go back to the 5-year forecast slide. There's a document on the right. This is the technical document I was talking about that's behind John's model. It's a very detailed plan that will be part of all of our future budget documents that we produce. And really, again, it's organized just like the flow chart, and on the bottom it says balance. So in FY17, the balance is 0. And then we look at what the balance is in years out, and then we decide how we can manipulate those levers or those toggles to impact the bottom line. So, I'm going to quickly walk you through the FY18 tax levy breakdown. I'm going to focus on FY18. The first line is the prior year levy limit. As most of us know, the prior year levy limit is comprised of the prior year's levy plus the 2.5% allowable under Proposition 2.5 plus the prior year's new growth. That equals the $130 million that you see in the top line under FY18. From that number, the 2.5% is generated, the $3.2 million. New growth at $2,039,798. That is reflective of the 5-year average, and that's a rolling average, one that we'll update every year of the plan. And then that's offset by the $300,000 in unused levy capacity. It results in a total tax levy, and again, it's a projection at this point in time where nothing has been certified, of $135,728,880, which is a 4.61% increase. We see a general fluctuation in levy increase, anywhere between 3.5 to 4.5, in this case 4.6%. That's largely driven this year by the strong new growth number. The next number you see on the bottom that we take out of that calculation is the debt exclusion. That is all debt that's been funded outside the limitations of Proposition 2.5. It's actually, if you remember, it decreased last year, yet it's increasing this year, and I just want to provide some background as to why. So under the MSBA's former funding model, we borrowed the total amount for a project and they reimbursed us annually. But in many cases, and it's very common throughout the Commonwealth, we pay off, they end their share before we've totally retired the debt associated with the project. So that is what's presenting an increase in FY18. And we will go through the exempt debt schedule in more detail. This is just a visual representation of the new growth history. We've had 3 strong years. We've decided to use a 5-year average because we don't want to base any assumption on what have been 3 of our strongest years in recent memory. The 5-year average is that $2 million, $40,000 figure. Just so as a point of information, the 10-year average is about 1.7 million, and the 3-year average is about 2.3 million. So really, we're taking a position that's really between those 2 averages. So this is a summary of the revenue assumptions. Again, the tax levy includes taking the 2.5% allowable under Proposition 2.5, the 5-year average of new growth, offset by $300,000 in excess levy capacity, state aid that is increasing in the 2 major accounts, Chapter 70 and unrestricted general government aid by 1%, which yields about $125,000 annually. And then lastly, the 5-year average of local receipts, which is just about 11.5 million, for a total revenue growth of 4.3.
And with the 4.3, you break that out to the average taxpayer increase, proper tax increase? That's the total town. What's
So we're
that further in here?
So we're not going to break out tonight what the actual increase in FY18 is going to be to the taxpayer on their average bill, for the simple reason that the information is not available to us this early in the fiscal year. As we get closer to the October 31st release of the capital improvement program, we'll have a much better idea of what that number will look like. The next section of the presentation is going to revolve around, and what I've done is I've broken out appropriations into 2 sections, really 3 sections. We're going to do appropriations for obligations, appropriation for debt and capital, and then appropriations for town and school operations. So I'm going to begin with appropriations for obligations, which will include retirement, health insurance, and other post-employment benefits, OPEB. So over the course of the past month, the Retirement Board took 2 votes. One, to vote to change the assumed rate of return, also known as the discount rate. In their last valuation, they used 7.75%. They reduced that to 7.25%, and they also voted to maintain the funding schedule through 2032. As a result, the unfunded liability went up. The schedule remained the same, therefore resulting in an increased appropriation each year. And in order to maintain the 2032 schedule, one other change. We were anticipating, based on the last, or what I refer to here as the former schedule, which is when the town put an extra $1 million in and inflated it by 8% a year to meet 2032. Now the town will be required to increase it 10% a year in order to maintain 2032. So there's a bar chart here that begins in 2017, where it doesn't change, but beginning in 18, there's an incremental change between what the former schedule provided for and what the new schedule provides for. Over a 5-year period, that's a $3.2 million increase in the plan. So I really want people to start thinking in the context of 5 years and the total value of each decision and how that affects the 5-year plan and how much money it either adds to it or takes out of it. So in this case, the 5-year cost will be $3.28 million. This is a relatively simple slide. We're continuing to program health insurance, increasing at a rate of 8%, increasing to a total budget of just under $25 million in FY22. So this slide has quite a bit of information in it. There are 3 columns. General fund OPEB appropriation. When I released the budget February 5th of last year, I proposed an OPEB funding strategy that moved away from free cash and rather use a percentage of budget as the metric. At that point, the budget was able to absorb a 0.4% of budget being appropriated, plus the water and sewer annual required contribution, also known as the ARC. And then we inflate that at about 2.5%. So that continues to be the general fund enterprise fund appropriation. On April 25th of this year, the Board of Selectmen voted to adopt an OPEB reform plan that increased retiree contributions in certain classes of retirees, the most significant being those who are non-Medicare eligible. So from that plan, there's a significant savings on an annual basis. It's a 4-year phase-in plan. Each year yields a greater savings. So the second column shows what that savings is and what the additional appropriation will be from the OPEB vote of April. And then in the third column, you'll see the total OPEB appropriation for not only the next 5 years, but for the next 10. The next chart shows all of the obligations that I just went through in the aggregate, and we chose a point in time that is the current retirement funding schedule of 2032 to show how those are compounded over time and as a total what the appropriation will lead to. So between health insurance, retirement, and OPEB, health insurance increasing at a rate of 8%, retirement increasing at a rate of 10%, and OPEB being funded as the schedule I showed in the prior slide. The total appropriation between the 3 obligations will be nearly $90 million in 2032. To the right, there's another column that shows obligations as a percentage of budget. You see that growing steadily from FY17 by just about 1% a year through FY22. So the next section, which is appropriations for capital and debt, I'm going to talk about the town's capital capacity, and then non-exempt debt and exempt debt within, or I'm going to try to talk about it within the context of the facility master plan. So the next slide has a bunch of numbers on it, and really I only included it to show the illustration that we use to get to the 5.7%. Throughout the entire FY17 budget process, I talked about the 5.7% being our target as we accelerate the investment in our facilities and our infrastructure. So basically what we do is we take the total revenue budget and we back out things that we shouldn't measure against. So we back out water and sewer enterprises and we back out exempt debt, and then we get to what we call an adjusted revenue budget. And then we have Article 5, the Capital Projects Fund, which is the cash capital outlay, and then non-exempt debt. And you see that the plan holds to the 5.7% through the life of the plan. This plan includes funding the construction phase of the municipal services facility, and it also includes considerations for a future Ballardville project. So to talk a bit about the facility master plan as it relates to the town, in the 10-year span, there was 4 projects for the town. The municipal services facility, or the moving of the town yard, which is in progress. That was the number 1 priority. The number 2 was Ballardville, which again, this is reflective of the initial funding. There were renovations to the center of Punchard, which is out a few years, and then there was the Shawshene School, which will obviously be part of a much larger discussion. But what I do want to say is that it's my position that all of those projects, notwithstanding something completely unforeseen, will be funded within the limitations of Proposition 2.5 in a fashion that is keeps us within that 5.7% cap. This just shows the general fund, again, non-exempt debt service schedule. It's reflective of the 5.7 that I showed you before. Obviously, we begin to see a pretty significant drop-off in 2028, and then get down to the point where our only debt service will be that of the town yard in Ballardville. So this next chart is much more relevant to the school building projects that are included in the facility master plan. This is the exempt debt service schedule. Again, this is all debt that was incurred outside the limitations of Proposition 2.5. It begins to, there's an increase, as I went over, from 17 to 18, but then it begins to drop quite slowly until FY22, when it begins to drop more precipitously. So one of the things that Dr. Berman and I have talked about, and I've talked to Donna about, is as the school committee deliberates on how we move forward with a capital program for the school buildings, we need to look at opportunities based on that plan to tier our debt so that it's really level impact to the taxpayers of Andover, or as much as possible. So like the model suggests, the last piece is town and school operations. So for any model, we have to project an annual increase. And it's my hope that, again, a dynamic document, there's things that are going to change. Charlie mentioned some, enrollment, out-of-district placement. What we did is we looked back at the average increases of both the school and the town on a 5-year basis. The school average increase was 4.7%. For the purposes of this plan and this plan alone, we've used 4.5% as an annual increase from FY18 through FY22. The town average increase has been closer to 3%. For the purposes of this plan, we've used 2.75. You see an FY18 total of $119 million, increasing to $138 million in FY22, based on the 4.5% on the school side and the 2.75% on the town side. So based on what I just went through, there is a structural impact. As we all know, revenue estimates and revenue projections and revenue assumptions offset the cost of our obligations, our capital and debt service, and the operations of both the town and school. So based on everything we went through today, the revenue estimates being what they are, with regard to property tax, the 2.5% allowable under Proposition 2.5, the 5-year average for new growth, the 5-year average for local receipts, a 1% increase in both Chapter 70 and unrestricted general government aid, which is in place to offset the obligation increases of a 10% increase in our retirement appropriation on an annual base, an 8% increase in health insurance, and then a 4.5% and a 2.75% school and town respective increases in their operational budgets. We're left with a structural impact that the next slide will illustrate. So the structural impact comes in the form of a structural deficit beginning in FY18, just over $800,000, and that becomes compounded over time through FY22, leading to a structural deficit of just over $10 million. I don't show these numbers by any means to raise doubt or lack of hope, but really to seize the opportunity to manage this, to start the discussion, and provide an opportunity for the Board of Selectmen, the school committee, the finance committee, to work with both the town and school administration to see how we can collaboratively work to mitigate this over time and do it in a way that is in the best interest of the town of Andover. So that was a lot of information. I'm happy to answer any questions or go back to any slides. If anybody in particular wants more detail.
Can you go to page 19 on the assumptions, the actual average? 4.5, the actual 4.7, let's say 4.5 and 2.75. Does that cover the collective bargaining agreements alone? I mean, that was one of our issues last year during.
Right, so the 2.75% on the town side, and I'll speak for the town side, would include cost of living and step increases for town employees, where that's the lion's share of the budget. A good portion of the available increase would go towards that, and then about 30% would go to expense-related line items.
Okay, and
This-
the school?
I think what you're asking is essentially the 4.5%, which is a little bit less than the average for the last 5 years, which is 4.7, included the cost of whatever increases, contractual increases took, it had an impact over the past 5 years. So we're projecting out, obviously those have not been negotiated yet. We haven't negotiated that agreement. Town is in the process of negotiating right now. We begin in negotiations probably in January, February, for our own contracts with all our employees. So it definitely has an impact on what that percentage would be. But so it's included in that estimate. Let's just say that. What it is, we haven't figured out. And that's not, those costs could just as well be minimal increases and maximal increases in out-of-district placements or other costs, or it could be contractual increases. These are things that, as Andrew has articulated, over time, we're going to have to say, okay, we now know our contractual increase. Once we negotiate it, it will look like this, and we will have the available funds for doing X or Y, or not have the available funds for doing X or Y as a result of that.
And just to make clear, we on the school committee are seeing this tonight for the first time, so we don't, the 4.5 was not a number we saw before coming in here tonight. So, this is all, I guess I'd put it as Andrew's presentation, but, I assume all subject to further discussion.
Right, if I can speak to that a little bit, for the purposes of tonight, and no board or committee has seen it yet, we had to use some metrics. So we used, in often cases, 5-year averages for the purposes of illustrating a picture. And that's really where we are tonight, where the beginning or the starting point of a long process.
By the way, when Andrew asked for data, and Paul Szymanski Paul really took the responsibility of putting together the 5-year averages. And initially, we took a look at what was our special ed increases, because Arlington, in the model that Arlington used, they had a different estimate for special education and regular education, and they handled that separately. Interestingly enough, when we looked at the 5-year average and separated it in both those categories, it averaged out to exactly the same 4.7, which was shocking to me. But it meant that in some years, our special education was 7% or higher, and in other years, and in that same year, our regular ed was close to 0. So there were cuts being made. So, it went back and forth in terms of the fluidity. But interestingly enough, both came out to about around 4.7. So we left it in as one estimate rather than two estimates, and trying to parse that out.
So it's a total number, so that it includes like the added personnel.
Yes.
The added personnel is in there because we've had
That's right.
over the last 10 years, a pretty
That's
big
right.
addition in the
So,
schools.
for example, the 4.5 there was a significant increase over the last 5 years in the number of teachers supporting English language learners. And that is included in it. I mean, there's all the expenses are included in it.
From a planning perspective, we have this information in front of us tonight. Where do we see the more detailed questions coming from, and do we have a scheduled plan for it? Because, if you look at the slide that shows we have a structural deficit of $10 million, it's not all that complicated. You either have to raise revenue, or you have to decrease expenses, or you have to do it in a combination of both. So when are we going to have the dialogue about, are there any considerations about overrides? When are we going to have the dialogue about the assumptions that are currently in place, which is based upon history, that we might have other revenue sources in the future? When should we have those questions? Or is tonight not the right place?
So I began the presentation with saying that there was no expectation for decisions to be made tonight. But one that may want to be considered is, when I've seen these plans work well, they've essentially had a governing body that is smaller than 19 people. So leadership from town and school, and then 2 representatives from each committee that work on a regular basis, get together much more frequently than a tri-board would, and talk about the assumptions, talk about the options, and then come back to the larger group and really talk about, and in often cases, we model this based on the dialogue that takes place, and we look at those assumptions and see what's in the best interest of the community. So what I would suggest, and if the support from the boards and the committee would be to create basically a subgroup that we call either the Long Range Financial Planning Committee or the 5-Year Financial Forecast Committee, that includes a combination of staff and representatives from the respective bodies that can sort of be the oversight group of the long range plan.
Andrew,
If I could add to
add
that.
on to John's question, I had the same question, is in your prior modeling, and you go in this approach, maybe it's also for Charlie as well, since in the situation you've got, right, it's a two-sided ledger, right? You've got a revenue and you've got an expense. So if you looked at both of those and said, okay, there's a requirement to deliver services differently to lower the cost, and then look at maximizing revenues, something like that. Is that part of, is that part of the model that you would look at?
Absolutely.
Clearly, yeah, 'cause
Utilization of revenue and opportunities to reduce expenses.
'Cause you
It's
take
both sides of the ledger.
Right, because if you just take that average, I mean, you don't have to go through too many, we knew this last year, right? That if you just looked at the vector that you were on, this was going to happen. So the question is, to get together, and would you put a model together that would show this broken out to either have a balanced budget and say, here's what the levels are, and see if services can be delivered at that? Or, I'm just wondering how that process would look. Otherwise, it seems.
So where this has worked well, there has been a task force or a governing committee to exchange ideas and to model things. I used to maintain the plan in Arlington, and I'd go to one of these meetings with 15, 18 models, showing reductions in areas, revenue enhancements, a combination of the two. And from there, we were able to sort of guide what the budget development process would look like.
Right, because I get, from this model, we've had gaps before, and they've been very one-time centric, right? So pieced together, and it doesn't look out beyond the next 12 months. So something like this, I would take in any of the changes that would have to be systemic changes.
You're absolutely correct, because we can close a gap, but that just creates a greater gap down the line.
Yeah, right, you did dig the hole, deeper. Okay.
Andrew, can we put up the final slide for a second? I just want to look at these projected deficits. The cumulative deficits you're saying over 5 years, if you add all these up, is about $27 million, correct? That's what I get from all these. And then we look back at slide 10, when you look at the new retirement funding schedule, $3.28 million. So a little more than 10% of that deficit is being caused by a new pension funding schedule that the retirement board has already voted on and approved, correct?
Correct.
Okay, and you had asked them to hold off on doing that until we had gone through that exercise.
I did make that request.
Okay, and they did not adhere to that. So there's not a whole lot we can do about that. And then going to page 13, when you look at these levers, I mean, this is astonishing here and not surprising, but that we are going to see obligations, health insurance, retirement, OPEB, rise from 16 to 20% of the budget in just 5 years. OPEB reform is already factored into this. Retirement is out of our control, as we just found out. And that retirement schedule, I might add, is in addition to a change made just last year that added $1 million a year to the prior schedule. And then finally, health insurance, other than basically municipal health reform, is our only tool there to control the cost. I'm just trying to get down to the levers that we have to control, and the final remaining lever, of course, is going to be the operating budgets. But on these major obligations, we're kind of running out of levers here.
I think that's a good summary, and I'll go right down the line, beginning with health insurance, as you said. Healthcare Reform Act of 2011 provides the town with certain levels to unilaterally exercise certain plan design changes. Outside of that, it's pretty limited, or go into the GIC. With regard to retirement, it's under the authority of the Andover Retirement Board. And then lastly, OPEB, as you had mentioned, we've voted, or the board voted an OPEB reform plan on April 25th.
Back to the planning question. Obviously, on the expense side, compensation as a whole is our single largest expense. When do contract negotiations begin? And when they do begin, are we going to include total compensation in the negotiations, which would include benefits?
So I'm actively involved in collective bargaining negotiations on the town side right now. All of the agreements have expired, so that's ongoing, and there are certain elements of total comp being discussed, many of which I can't get into tonight.
Andrew, my question, am I correct in the assumption that all of this assumes no additional debt for school projects over the next 5 years?
Not necessarily, because, as I said, I believe most of the school projects will be of the scale that they'll require most likely a debt exclusion, which would be outside the limitations of Proposition 2.5. So there'd be a dedicated revenue source to fund the dedicated expense. So it'd be a one-for-one on the revenue and expense side of the ledger.
So it wouldn't affect that structural deficit?
It would not.
Okay.
Well, I think there's some clarity that needs to be, one of the assumptions that I heard you say, and maybe this is a point for clarification, is that there were town buildings, the Ballardvale Fire Station, Center at Punchard, and the town yard that we would pay for without a debt exclusion, but we would have the schools paid for potentially with the debt exclusion. That's an assumption, right? I mean, we haven't so much as discussed. I understand the facility plan came back and had a priority suggested based on the conditions, but there still remains a community discussion to be had as to what our actual priorities are and what we pay for with existing money versus what we fund, right?
No, very, very good point. And what I would add is that the assumption is based on value. The Ballardvale Fire Station, the town yard, and even if you wanted to include the Center of Punchard, those collectively don't even come close to the value of a single school, which is why I would tend to recommend that they be funded within the levy rather than use up exempt capacity, which could otherwise be used for larger scale school projects.
And then the other point I just want to make sure that we're all clear on, John, is when we talk about total compensation, when the teacher's contract, for example, that will be begin to negotiate with the later this winter, the levers in that do not speak to total compensation. So the levers in the negotiation, the contract that will be on the table, do not include health care, right? That's negotiated through the PEC. They do not include retirement because the town of Andover doesn't pay into the teacher's retirement at all. So the levers aren't fully in what's being negotiated. I just want to make sure that we all are on the same page around that.
The levers in the past have not included negotiating health care.
It's not in the contract is the point I'm making.
My question then is, when are we going to have that dialogue about going forward? And will we include that in the contract negotiations?
Yeah, I don't know what the plans are, if there's still going to be a PEC moving forward, but
Well, and my question, my other question would be,
Healthcare
if,
has to be negotiated collectively
contribution splits are still based on the current arrangement under Section 22 of Chapter 32B. Contribution splits between the town and school employees' contributions have to be negotiated individually with the separate unions. We're not under Schedule 19, which would allow us to negotiate, it's called coalition bargaining around health insurance.
So, Andrew, can you just clarify that? So what you're saying is municipal health reform relates to plan design. That's what's done with the PEC, plan design.
Correct.
But as far as premium contributions, which would feed in with total compensation, that is collectively bargained.
Correct.
Okay. On both the school side and the town side. Okay.
Well, and again, I don't want to get down into the weeds tonight on it, but the healthcare is what employees pay and what the town pays. And my question is, what about our claims? What's driving our claims? And is there anything we can do to mitigate the growth of the claims cost? I think the answer to that is yes, and I think we should have a dialogue about that, but maybe that's one of those future meetings.
Sure.
Okay.
If I could, as I had a one-day advantage on the rest of the group, as Andrew and John gave me a brief perspective on this. And in fact, if you go back to the last slide, which is what Bob asked for before, around the debt, there are many assumptions that go into that. So for example, we ended up $800,000 more in new growth than we anticipated this year. If that trend continues, we won't see that kind of deficit. It may not. We may actually end up worse, and we may see a greater deficit. In terms of state aid, right now, the assumption is 1%. It may be more, it actually may be less. So the obligation that I think we have is to understand what are the trends. I think, Andrew, I just want to acknowledge the work that Andrew and John have done, and Donna has been intimately involved in this.
Very much so.
That this is terrific work. This gives us a template to plan. And it is important that we have this long-term perspective, but it's also important that we know that there are many variables. I think John just pointed out one, which is how do we control our costs? And that's all of these, and you pointed out many about control. And so there are many variables that we're going to have to work with, and we're going to have to pay close attention to how we manage this so we don't end up with a $10 million deficit and accumulated deficit. Some of that may be revenue, some of that may be cost reductions and other factors, like the negotiations that we have. But I just want to say that each year we're going to have to go back and I think Andrew's suggestion of having a smaller group, look at the assumptions, evaluate the assumptions, and do what we can. And then each year we will work through what that looks like and to see if we can have an impact. I think it's all of our hopes that we don't end up like this, because this is a good situation to end up in. But at the same time, there is, and I want to go back to something that Charlie said earlier, I think this community is a community that values its services, and Andrew said this earlier. And so at some point, we have to weigh what are the services we're providing against what are the costs and contributions that we're making.
And if I could follow up to Dr. Berman's comments, I think he's exactly right. When I started in Arlington, it was a 3-year plan that is now projected to be a 9-year plan. So we were showing a structural deficit 3 years out based on the decisions they made as a community on both sides of the ledger, and some things that became available to the town that at the beginning of the plan, they never saw. Healthcare reform happened. Things will happen in the next 5 years that aren't available to us now. And through a combination of decisions and tools available to the community, a 3-year plan became a 9-year plan. So this is not absolute, it's not concrete, it's just a starting point.
Regarding the schools, so you're assuming a 4.5% increase when it was 4.7%, and I know that in the process, certain things were not done that you wanted to do. So why do we believe that we can do 4.5% going forward?
Well, I'm glad to put in 5%, but it would driven it further. No, in essence, both Andrew compromised on the town side, we compromised a bit on the school side. You know, there's some things that I hope that we can contain by, for example, our special ed costs. Charlie said that's an area that I have a good deal of expertise in, and I hope that we can see some balancing of that as we move forward. That will take some time. I'm not sure of this. One of the things that will contribute, and it's part of the reason that I recommended that we do a master plan for the schools. When you actually invest in buildings, you reduce operating costs, and you actually reduce costs of some basic requirements like technology, furniture, a whole range of other things that are a benefit. So the balance of having a master plan and knowing that along the years that we're moving forward with, we will be able to invest in our facilities, which will reduce costs over time and displace other costs that we would have incurred, may allow us to manage better.
I also wondered, will the process change now that you have a target? So I applaud this. I love the Eisenhower quote, by the way. It was great. But I applaud the creation of a plan. With a target, will it change our process so that instead of coming up with all of the things you would want to do, you'd actually start out with a target and then try to fit the plan to the target? Just wondering if that would change.
Great question, Bonnie, and I think it begins with a target that we agree upon for operations, and then we back into that target. It really brings some ease to a process where you know what your next year's target's going to be, and you start the planning process building in or backing into that target. With regard to our process as it functions as a budget process overall, many people probably won't want to volunteer for the smaller committee when I tell them this. It starts in July, and we begin to go through a whole process of assumptions and development of models so that we can basically account for things that may not have been an issue the year prior, or include things that weren't available as a tool perhaps the year before, leading up to the more robust budget discussion that happens
And
in
more
the fall.
fluid, so that 4.5 is a target, it's not necessary, I mean, like in both cases, town and school, it's the overall plan that you're building.
Right.
And just keep in mind, to reiterate what I said earlier,
Yeah.
we haven't agreed, I mean, we're just saying this 4.5.
Oh, I know, I'm actually applauding the framework. I understand that, you know, understanding the levers is step one, and I think it's,
Well, but, I mean, the process makes perfect sense, but, you know, the specific targets, I think that, I assume will be discussed in the smaller group you're talking about, and then eventually with the larger group.
So the 4.5 and 2.75, I understand those aren't the 5-year average. Are those percentages that Shelley and Andrew, you both have committed to target? Or
I don't think I can commit. I think this group has to make the commitment. Let me just be really clear, and I think just like the Board of Selectmen have to make that commitment.
do you feel that's attainable based upon your vision of what operations will be? Because, you know, if we don't think that that's attainable, you probably should have shown 4.7 and 3%, and actually shown what the $1.1 million deficit that we would have next year, as opposed to trying to make it look a little better at $800,000 deficit.
So I will say we didn't do anything to deliberately make anything look better. We're still, you know, the assumption still yield a $10 million deficit in 5 years. But really, it's just a starting point for a discussion. We haven't had any kind of robust discussion whether or not 2.75 or 4.5 would be sufficient. What we can say, on an average basis, it's pretty close to what we've done in the past. Right.
There are going to be years like this last year where we had an $800,000 increase in special ed costs. And, you know, or you have a heroin crisis where you need to devote additional staff. There are going to be decisions that need to be made that incur additional costs. And on some years, it may be higher, and some years it may be lower. Yeah, I haven't, as I said, Paul produced the averages. We gave those to Andrew. There has been no conversation on the part of the school committee about these as targets.
So I don't want to, I can't commit to that.
So, and then if something, to that point, so again, reflecting on past experiences, we committed to percentage increases across the board, and when something extraordinary or unexpected happened, in the case of Arlington, it was extraordinary, 1,000 new students to the district in 5 years. We took the model, which was the technical plan that I think I showed on the second slide, and we didn't inflate the annual percentage increase. We added a new line and developed what we called an enrollment growth factor that offset the unpredictability of that new issue in town. So I think it's important as we move forward with this process is that we do develop targets with an understanding that the plan is dynamic and there are going to have to be modifications in order to account for the unexpected.
So Andrew, if this work is supposed to start in July, this is August.
The light. That's why we're here. Yeah.
I guess we would want to not leave here without some idea of what your vision is for this group, how many people, if each of the boards would appoint one or two, and which department heads. I mean, I think if we can structure that, at least understand what your vision is for that group, how large it would be, and maybe we can get it going quickly.
So what I would imagine is 2 members of the Board of Selectmen, 2 members of the Finance Committee, 2 members of the School Committee, myself, John, Donna, and I imagine Shelley would bring members of his leadership team as well.
So I think we should probably get those people appointed now, and as soon as, maybe not tonight, but as soon as we can.
Yeah, I would encourage the chairs to talk to their boards.
We- I have to point out that we used to do this. We did it for a number of years, that we had a group, just exactly what you're talking about. And for a number of years, it worked really well. So I think it's time that we get back to that, because that's one way of getting all the factors out on the table in the budget process, and make sure that we're balancing things the way we should. But it did work.
You're volunteering.
It is, I think, Charlie hearing this and having that experience, I was just asking the question, what are your thoughts and reactions and advice given what you've heard? I don't know that I asked you to be able to speak.
It's the only available mic.
You don't have to ask.
Notice the town manager shut off Shelley's mic and kept his on. Just listening here, I mean, I assume this august body that you're recreating, maybe one of your first meetings would be with the retirement board, and I'm not kidding about that, because that is, remember, the Finance Committee pointed out Jim pointed out, has a major impact upon this plan, and just understanding the logic. I thought the chairman of the Finance Committee made an excellent point. You have a self-funded health insurance plan, and the 8% assumption assumes a tremendous increase in claims. So can you initiate wellness programs in the school department, in the town, to take a look at some of those, what we call revenue busters? I think a working group like this can come up with some suggestions where maybe you can address some of those revenue challenges that the manager pointed out, and have discussions with other bodies to sort of understand the logic. So, but the first beginning is the plan and to meet. But my original assumption was 8% in the pension cost. You want to have a discussion, I think, at some point with Andrew and John about the assumptions for the pension cost as well. Those 3 components eat up 20% of your available revenues. So I think you want to do 2 things. I think you want to look at, okay, what's driving this and what behavioral modifications can we make in the logic of whether you should extend or not extend a retirement payback schedule, I think is a key discussion to have. Before you go to the voters, I guess, if you don't have those discussions, you're not going to have a plan. So sitting here listening, a lot of good ideas have gone around this table tonight.
their full committees very closely informed about what's being discussed. I just think we can't afford to have a situation where the smaller group is all happy with what they're coming up with, and then their boards won't support it. We will have wasted a lot of time. That's what we do. So I think each of the representatives are going to have to figure out a way to keep their boards and committees fully advised as to what's being discussed. If it's their sense that they just won't buy that, and that needs to come back to the.
Well, it's
to
not
the smaller
decision-making,
committee.
right?
It's not, but it doesn't make sense to have a lot of, it's pre-decision-making, if you have to spend a lot of time, think you're making progress, and then say, I go back to the school, I'm on this smaller group, I go back to the school committee, and they say, you're crazy. We can't support what you're.
I would agree with that. I think it's important, and I think that there should even be some agreements, some consensus, some votes along the way, just so that you don't get surprised at the end when there are votes, as long as the information is known.
And I think as we move forward with this approach, it's going to be important to build credibility in not only the plan, but the process. And what I foresee is that we have a lot of tri-boards beginning in the fall, that an update on the plan is included in every single tri-board we have. And I think that'll be a good way to keep the larger group of 19 informed, and if there are interim updates, that's certainly a reasonable request, I think.
I just wanted to say I was wrong, and John, sorry, you were right. There is language about the healthcare. Yeah. I looked it up, you're right. I was wrong. I'll say it again. The teacher's contract says that the town of Andover will pay the maximum allowable under Chapter 32B, so I apologize for my error.
And I feel that this committee can really help the town manager and the school committee as they go forward with contract negotiation, because this is a really big chunk. I mean, most of what we spend our money on as a town is our people, is our personnel. And John's right, we have to look at the total package, because it's not just the salaries that we pay them, it's their benefits as well. In the last 2 years, the contract agreements that had been signed for the school, the amount that the increases were more than the town manager initially offered the schools totally. So, I mean, I think knowing those kinds of things before we even go in is really vital. And, you know, working together with our unions as well as our taxpayers, we've got to be unified. I mean, what you said before, it's right, we're in this together. We can't be pitting one side against another. And I just have to say, I was away a lot this summer, but I would come home and catch up reading the local newspapers, the Eagle Tribune and the Townsman. And I think there was, unfortunately, a lot of sort of divisive, non-unitive talk, particularly around the OPEB issue, but maligning or bad-mouthing individuals who are trying to approach this very serious issue that affects all of us. I think we need to stay in a collaborative situation where we're working together and not pitting one side against the other, because it does impact all of us. And, you know, since, just one example, I just have to say this a little bit. You know, there were things thrown out that just were not true. For instance, decisions that the town made around OPEB were done hastily. I look back for the last 6 years, the Finance Committee book letter addressed OPEB. 6 years. It was actually in the book, which tells me people either didn't go to town meeting or they didn't read their FinCom book, for shame. But I mean, we've been talking about this for a long time. We've had citizens coming to meeting, standing up and trying to get the town to pay attention to these issues. We've had several elections where it was the focus of Board of Selectmen or what have you.
And so, I think we need to stay open, transparent, honest, and very collaborative with one another when we're dealing with these really tough issues. And we need to think about everybody, all the taxpayers, all the retirees, all of our employees. We're one town. I think we have a lot of smart people around this table. I think we can do it. And I hope moving forward we can stay more positive. Sorry, I had to just get it over.
Anything else from boards?
Yeah.
I'll open up to the public in a minute.
Andrew and Paul, on the revenue side of things, would it make sense to have some of the economic development
What I might suggest is to have Paul Matarazzo, when we're talking about next year's development, it's probably one meeting, to invite him to come in and provide an update.
Makes sense.
What I wanted to say is that one of the benefits of having this kind of a group is that you have a couple people on each board who become very well educated, very knowledgeable about what's going on. And the information that goes out to the community improves the general level of understanding among the taxpayers of our community as to what the needs are and how things are going to work or not work. Because that whole credibility is really critical.
Any other board questions? Any members of the public like to? Mr. Hartwell?
Hi, I'm Tom Hartwell, Freedom Off Road. I'm on the retirement board. And hi, Charlie, I don't know if you remember me, I went to Duke High School. Nice to see you. We're going out afterwards, Rick. I just want to follow up on something Charlie had to say when he mentioned retirement. Yes, there was a vote taken to keep the same funding date. There's nothing magical about that funding date, 2032. The statutes require 2040. Prior to last year, we were 2038 by putting an extra million in, it brought us down to 232. If we went with the same funding schedule, at 8% increase, we'll probably push yourself to 2034. Eric would like to see you around 2035, but again, the statutes require 2040. Tomorrow we're voting the retirement board on the actuarial report. I think it would be in the town's best interest to, again, try to address the retirement board to convince them to change their mind and consider maintaining the same funding schedule.
Okay, are there any other questions from the public or the board? Seeing none, Andrew, you all set?
I'm all set. I would just encourage, given that we are late in August, that the boards consider who their representatives would be to this committee so we can convene sooner rather than later.
We'll put it on the next Board of Selectmen meeting, and I would encourage the other board members to do the same.
Mr. Chair, if I may, before we close for the evening, I think we should thank Beth and her team for the meeting here tonight and putting everything together. And then also the news that the new roof porch is open. So if anyone wants to take a walk down.
They're serving beer out there. Okay, with that, is there a motion to adjourn? Second. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? We are, Board of Selectmen is adjourned.
There's a motion for the finance committee to adjourn.